Chapter 6 covers public opinion. First important question to ask when covering this topic is, what shapes public opinion? Well, first define it. Public opinion is everyday citizens and their attitudes towards political issues, leaders, institutions, and events. It's a very formal definition. Really the most important piece here, citizens' attitudes. What do citizens think about specific issues? Now, shaping public opinion is mostly a personal thing, such as a person's individual values. What things do they live by on a daily basis that they value? The other thing that can affect public opinion is political ideology. This is a very cohesive set of beliefs that you have, sometimes affiliated with a particular political party, and again, that's going to shape what you view of major issues. And how do individuals shape their ideology? Well, first you have the concept of political socialization. This really means that you are first exposed to the ideas relevant to politics and government. So you might be first exposed to those things at home by your parents. Maybe your parents have very specific political beliefs. So that's when you're first going to be socialized as to those political beliefs. Other times it might not be until you take a course like this, political science, as a senior in high school. So political socialization, when are you first exposed to some of those political concepts? Then you have agencies of socialization. And like I said, that could be your family, that could be at school, or it could be other social institutions like church, synagogue, or any type of religious gathering place. And you can see that in this visual off to the right, what different things make up that individual person's political ideology. There are two main schools of thought, liberal and conservative. Today, liberal really means people who support social and political reform or change. They believe in extensive government intervention in the economy, the expansion of social services, more vigorous efforts on behalf of the poor, on behalf of minorities, and on behalf of women, and greater concern for consumers and for the environment. This is very loaded with information. So what are we talking about with social services? Well, we're talking about things like the Social Security system for the elderly, unemployment insurance for those who lose their jobs. What is meant by government intervention in the economy? Well, some of the organizations created in the Great Depression as part of Roosevelt's New Deal, such as the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to give people confidence in their banking deposits again. Or the Securities and Exchange Commission, regulating how stocks are traded. Those are things that would have once been thought of as absolutely crazy, that after the experience of the Great Depression, people thought, that's much more of an acceptable role for the government to play. More vigorous efforts on behalf of the poor, on behalf of minorities, on behalf of women. Historically speaking, efforts on behalf of the poor could be the graduated income tax and then the redistribution of wealth by that income tax then being given to lower class citizens via various social service programs, which we already mentioned. Working on behalf of minorities, such as the civil rights movement that led to the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, or on behalf of women, the equal rights movement of the 1970s that almost led to the adding of a constitutional amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment. Greater concern for consumers makes me think of the progressive era reforms of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, and those fall under what's thought of as consumer protection. And then environmental protection, such as the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency by President Richard Nixon when he was in office, and further conversations about the effects of climate change that continue today. So these are all things that can be tied back in to the large amount of information that was packed into this definition. What does conservative mean? Well, today this term refers to those who generally support the social and economic status quo. They do not want to see huge changes. They don't think that new changes often lead to anything positive, but in fact lead to negative consequences. Conservatives also believe that a large and powerful government poses a threat to citizens' freedom. So a lot of what is outlined up here, conservatives would say, that's not a good idea. And in fact, a lot of the efforts that are being spoken of in this definition of liberal, they think will only be screwed up by the government, that they won't actually be successfully run, and worse yet, could end up being a threat to individual citizens' freedoms and liberties. There are also other more unorthodox schools of thought, and socialism is one of them. And this is democratic control of the means of production, which just means publicly owned businesses rather than privately owned businesses. The government essentially would run the economy. Here's a political cartoon which shows that, people under the boot of someone else, in this case it would be government. The difference between fascism and socialism is that fascism is very dark and dreary and is top down, government down on the people. And it is still that under socialism, except because it's democratic, because the people voted in its favor, now it's all sunshine and rainbows. So it's meant to be a joke, but really it just means that there's still a ton of government power. It's just a matter of, did the citizens vote in favor of the government having that much power, or didn't they? Other unorthodox schools of thought, libertarianism, which emphasizes political freedom, voluntary association, and the primacy of individual judgment. Really, this is fiscal conservatism and social liberalism. So it's taking some of the economics and taking a very conservative approach to that. Then it's taking social issues, same-sex marriage, abortion, for example, and saying that's not anybody's place to tell anybody else how to live their life. So fiscal conservatism, social liberalism. That is libertarianism in a nutshell. But again, this is not a very widespread political belief. The two main schools of thought, liberal and conservative, tend to be the largest percentage of people. Now, the political spectrum in general. You have on an axis here, tyranny versus liberty. Okay? On one extreme end, you have total government control. That is that concept of the boot of government squashing the people in that political cartoon from before. Then, at the other extreme, you have anarchy, mob rule, chaos. Neither one of these extremes is a good thing. Moderate is a term that describes someone who says, listen, there is an appropriate role for the government to have power. So left-leaning a little bit. Then there's other circumstances where we shouldn't give the government that much power. Much more right-leaning. To be moderate means you can see both sides of an argument and reach some kind of happy medium. Who is most likely to be politically active? People who believe that they have political efficacy, and we have covered this term before, will come out and vote. If they think they have an influence, their voice matters, they will come out and vote. People who are older tend to vote in higher rates than people who are younger. Not only have they had more life experience, but the government and the government's power is something that matters a little more to elderly people, because things like Social Security and Medicare benefits, for example, are something they don't want to see go away. Now, how do you know public opinion on an issue? Well, first of all, you have public opinion polls. This is a very scientific way of measuring public opinion. Percentages of people and whether they agree or disagree with an issue, support or oppose a certain candidate. To take a sample means that a small group is selected by researchers to represent the most important characteristics of an entire population. So that could be very random, or if you want very specific information, you could poll specifically Republicans, you could poll specifically Democrats, you could poll specifically independents. And depending on what type of information you want to gather, will shape not only who you sample, but what questions you ask them. And you can see here a couple of examples, bar graphs and pie graphs, of how public opinion data can be gathered and then pushed out on the news for people to see. Now, what can shape a poll's result? Well, first of all, you have selection bias. This means that there is a polling error, that certain groups have been overrepresented or certain groups have been underrepresented. So if you're asking way more of one political party than another the same questions, then it's probably going to be skewed in that party's favor. So you want to be a little more random if you are trying to have less selection bias. A sampling error means a polling error because of the small size of the sample. If only a couple hundred people are being polled on a political issue, there's going to be a larger margin for error there. If you have thousands of people being polled, you're going to have a much smaller margin for error. You also have measurement error. And a measurement error most often has something to do with poorly worded questions. So instead of asking extremely direct yes or no questions, you might ask questions that you end up getting a little bit more of a rhetorical answer to, and that's harder to quantify. That's harder to put out to people in those bar and pie graphs that I showed on the previous slide. And then last, you have the issue of push polling. And this is a technique in which questions are designed to shape the respondent's opinion. So for example, President Trump, who was a very divisive figure because of his personality, his big mouth, if you were to pose questions to people saying, do you support President Trump? Very simple, yes or no. If it says, do you support President Trump despite his behavior in the media? That's adding a layer to the question that could shape what the respondent's opinion is going to be. And that is textbook push polling. More terms that go along with polling. Salient interest means that the attitudes and views of the people being polled are going to come out in the polling numbers. So if you are polling an extremely religious, very, very Christian neighborhood, and you're asking religious-based questions, then you're probably going to get a very good idea of just how important their religious beliefs are to them. Salient interest just means it's going to become very obvious what is most important to the people that you are polling. You also have what's known as the illusion of saliency. Now, sometimes this is through things like push polling, getting certain answers that you wanted, and it's to give the impression in a poll that something is important to the public when it might not actually be important to the public. So the illusion of saliency means this is important to this group of people. Well, actually it's not that important to them, but you asked about it. So right now, early 2022, one of the biggest issues in the news is inflation of the economy. So that's probably one of the most salient interests of people. But if during a poll that had almost everything to do with economics and inflation, you all of a sudden asked a random question about something else, and you got a certain result from that, and then you put it out there that people said this and it's so important to them. It's like, well, actually that was kind of an add-on question and it's not all that important to them. And that is illusion of saliency. The bandwagon effect is a big shift in electoral support to a candidate who public opinion polls report as the frontrunner. So when party primaries happen, for example, it's often the first person to jump out in a lead that ends up winning, because people, once they see that person leading, are more willing to get behind who they think could end up being the winner. And then lastly, you have media bias. When the media tends to favor one candidate over another for office, you have that bandwagon effect being exacerbated by media coverage. And there was a lot of attention paid to the fact that when President Trump, who I already mentioned once, was elected president, his securing of the Republican Party nomination and then victory in the 2016 election was often attributed to the kind of attention that he got from the media. It wasn't always positive attention, but his name was always in the media. And so some people thought that gave him essentially free campaigning for his name to be in the media constantly. And we mentioned the media. Here's a funny political cartoon on the left of a man and woman turning on the television and saying, do you want to be manipulated by the left wing or the right wing media? And then here's another funny political cartoon. Hey, Johnson, do you have the results from our latest political poll? Yes, boss, right here. And it says 78% of Canadians hang up on opinion pollsters in the run-up to an election. Yeah, nice try, Johnson. Now get back on the phones. So this is actually a real issue, though, and why some pollsters have shifted their strategies on how to gather information, because they're having a really hard time getting people to agree to even answer polling questions over the phone anymore. That's the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, by all means, reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you in class.